And
Great. Yeah, good. Yeah,
you've been busy. You're really busy, aren't you?
I'm always busy. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I wanted to talk to you about how you got into conversation analysis, but I just looked you up online, which sounds kind of stalkerish, and it's not meant to. But how did you all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, break out and have TED Talks and Guardian articles and all these things happening?
Um, I was really lucky in 2011. I didn't know this was going to happen at the time, of course, because you never know what's coming. I was interviewed by the Psychologist magazine. They were doing features of psychologists' careers, and I think they wanted a social psychologist. And unbeknownst to me, the people who decide who's going to go on this BBC Radio 4 program called The Life Scientific look at the psychologist. And so that actually, so the Psychologist magazine piece, which, you never know, is anyone even going to read that? That turned out to be something that the BBC, whoever was commissioning the Life Scientific, they were looking at that, and that was the turning point, because the people who commissioned TED, they look at the Life Scientific. So it was one of those kinds of events where you suddenly find that by saying yes to things that sound quite scary, you can suddenly be quite thrust into the public eye.
So that was your big break. That was like you getting noticed by somebody, and all of a sudden everything started happening.
Yeah.
Was that something you were looking for? I mean, were you thinking about a life in public as a public social psychologist or a public sociologist? Was that, you were looking for that?
No, not at all. I've never thought about anything really very much. I've just tended to follow my nose. And that sounds a bit limp, but I'm a very yes person. I'm a proactive person, but I never went looking for all the stuff that I've done now. That's for sure. No.
Yeah, that'll get you into trouble, saying yes too much.
Yeah.
So you probably want to be careful about that. But it sounds like, I mean, it's interesting for me as a conversation analyst, and we're conversation analysts. I mean, let me rephrase that. I am an ethnomethodologist, which we can explain what that means, who does conversation analysis. I don't know that I would ever consider myself to be an actual conversation analyst, because my transcriptions don't look that good when I look at real conversation analysts.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm sure there are people who don't think I'm a real conversation analyst either, but I worry less about that these days. I used to worry about that and whether I was, trained properly by the right people and all those things. But mostly now what I realize I'm quite good at is translating the world of conversation analysis for people who are really interested in conversation and whose communication is key to what they're doing every day in some fundamental way. So that's my skill.
Well, it's an important skill to have, and I want to ask you more about that. But first, how did you end up in this conversation analysis space? Because I don't know. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about me, because even though I'm talking to you, let's make it about me for a second.
Yeah.
I think there's those of us who grow up just noticing things, and then you come across this area, whether it be, generally speaking, ethnography, but more specifically studying what people do in very fine-grained detail, and it just kind of clicks. Was that what it was like for you, or how did you end up doing conversation analysis and being trained in it?
It was also just by accident, really. So I did a psychology degree, which didn't have anything remotely. I mean, conversation analysis is not taught in psychology generally, especially in the UK. Right. So I didn't get anything like that, not even any discourse analysis or anything like that in my degree. But then I just was applying for things after my degree that had PhD in them and psychology without being very aware of what I was applying for, which is a bit shocking, really. And I met the woman who became my PhD supervisor, Eunice Fisher, and she was running a project on students' tutorial in universities. No one had really looked very much at what happens in university classrooms, a lot of work on school classrooms. And I was interested in gender. And so I thought I was going to do a PhD in a kind of socio-linguistic tradition of men talk this way, women talk that way, men dominate the space in the classroom and women don't. So that was my sort of way into it. I didn't know anything about sociolinguistics. I didn't know anything about discourse, language, or anything outside of a psychology degree, really. But I also, just because of the way the PhD was set up at the institution that I did it, I needed an external supervisor. And my supervisor knew Neil Mercer, who had written a book with Derek Edwards. And Derek Edwards became my external PhD supervisor, and he gave me Sax's lectures.
Right.
And the thing that made it click for me was more that I had these video recordings of students talking in small groups, and I could see that the transcripts in Sax's lectures were the kinds of things I could produce. And I could see that it didn't look anything like qualitative psychology. So I didn't have interviews or focus groups. I didn't have that kind of material. I had naturally occurring interaction. And so it was really just that I could see a boundary around these lectures. I could see a method, compared to discourse analysis, which is there are so many versions and strands and lots of theory, and I had no background in any of that really. And I was reading all that stuff thinking, I can't see how to apply a lot of this discourse analysis stuff to my data, but I can see how if I do a transcript that looks a bit like these transcripts in Sax's lectures, I could do something with that.
Right. So that sounds like a pretty good training. I mean, Sax's lectures sounds like a pretty good training program.
Yeah, but I saw Derek maybe 3 times in my PhD, and my supervisor was not a conversation analyst. She was a cognitive psychologist. So I was finding my way through it quite naively, probably at the start. And it was only really by the end of the PhD that I had a sense that I kind of knew what I might be doing, but it took me a while because I didn't really have that much guidance. I was just figuring it out and trying to figure out the difference between sociolinguistics, discourse analysis, conversation analysis, with not a lot of steer. I mean, my supervisor was brilliant and Derek was brilliant, but I was kind of figuring it out, which maybe is a good thing. You know, I ended up doing a PhD that was completely what I wanted to focus on, and that was great.
I think I'm still trying to figure all that out sometimes, you know, where people ask me, what's the difference? I'm like, that's a really good question. Let me get right back to you. And I often explain it as what we don't do versus like, well, we don't do this.
Yeah.
They might interpret why a lot. We try to describe how a lot.
Yeah.
And you know, it's what's in the data. They don't do that as much what's in the data, you know? And so I think it's always a thing we struggle with and that's one of the reasons why you were so successful is that translation element.
Yeah.
And so when you're at like a party and you tell people what you do for research, do they also get really self-conscious immediatly?
I don't go to parties.
Well, that's one way of solving that. I don't either. I like asking that question to make it sound like I go to parties, but I really don't. So
the thing is, though, being a psychologist and being a conversation analyst is a bit of a conversation stopper, or at least it makes people self-conscious. So I do experience that from time to time.
And when you describe it to people, like what it is we do or you do, you know, besides being a psychologist, people get to like, you know, oh, you're analyzing me. Then you say, I analyze conversations for a living. Then they really get self-conscious. How do you describe what CA is for people who don't know what it is?
I think it's more the case that people actually just make huge assumptions about what it is that you do. So they immediately then they're you know, in some kind of classic irony, they hear that you study conversation and immediately their head is filled with all of the things they've picked up from pop psychology along the way, and then tell me that's what I'm probably doing. And you know, depending on the context, I might take another turn and say, no, it's not quite like that, or I might just go, yeah, you know, because I don't want to have a conversation about communication's 90% body language, or men and women talk differently, or all the things that people have picked up about communication along the way. And this is one of the really interesting things about studying communication. And I say this a lot when I'm giving these lectures, and that is that everyone thinks communication is really important. So if you Google communication is, Google will fill it with key. Communication is key. So everyone thinks communication is important, right up until the moment that they're prepared to take it so seriously as we do as conversation analysts. And then it's actually quite a big leap for people to go from being kind of interested in what you're doing to really wanting to take it seriously. And I suppose what I've managed to do with probably, you know, a very small proportion of people in the world that I ever meet, but it turns out to be quite a lot of people for one academic to try and work with, is people who actually are quite committed to, we don't want to train people with all this stuff that we've picked up along the way. We actually do want to see what people are doing that is effective, because when I'm doing my kind of, you know, end user work, I'm not telling people what I think they should do. I'm showing them what they're doing that works, and they don't know it because they would always do that, and they wouldn't do the things that I'm showing them doesn't work.
I think it's such a huge point, because what I found, you know, as a person in academia, loosely in academia, sometimes I feel like, not entirely in academia, is that talking with people who are in areas of business or legal analysis, talking to defense attorneys, doing legal work, they're less interested, or they're very interested in what you can show them tangibly, and less interested in theoretical structures that an academic might use to interpret or create opinions about why something is going on. Have you had the same kind of experience?
Yeah, I think, I mean, academic audiences in front of conversation analysts, if they're not conversation analysts, will always ask the same old questions, and we know them. What about power? What about structure? What about, all the kind of, what about context? What about culture? All those big questions that conversation analysts get asked. And actually lay audiences ask all the same questions as well. So somewhere, that tells me something, which is somewhere along the way, people have picked up, whether they're actually in academia or are outside of academia, people have picked up things that they think they know about communication. And conversation analysis shows that a lot of these things are just wrong, but they're very hard to knock over because too many people believe them already.
Right. And which probably makes the psychology degree helpful, because you can understand what's going on in their minds about how these things influence their behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows you that they just seek out things that confirm what they already know, or even actually not even seeking it out. People just believe stuff, and so trying to overcome things that are going to change the way people think about communication is difficult. I also know from experience that most folks can't really go away with more than one or two messages, so you've got to be quite careful how you deliver findings that took a lot of research into something digestible and usable, but also not so simple that you end up creating your own myths that people just start perpetuating as well. Right. And I worry about that sometimes.
Right. And so you go to school to study psychology. Why psychology, by the way? Like what was
psychology? Because I couldn't do physics.
Well,
so
that's good.
I think there are a lot of people. No, actually, I shouldn't say this. I just know one or two people have said this to me, where I was doing maths, physics, and chemistry for my final school subjects, and I was really bad at physics. I blame the fact that I went to a Catholic school, and I was taught by nuns who didn't really believe in some of it.
Science,
yeah,
gravity.
That's not true either. I had a great school, but still, I just couldn't really do the physics very well. So I picked up another A-level at night so that I would have enough A-levels to get to university. And so I ended up with maths, chemistry, and psychology.
So psychology was your safety subject?
It was my safety subject.
Couldn't do physics, so I might as well do psychology instead.
Yeah, and I think it was because at the time psychology had become a thing. So this was in the very late 80s. I did my A-levels in 1990, and at the time on the television as well was the birth of the forensic psychologist as well, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff in the ether about psychology, and I think it just must have been in the ether for me to pick it up. I mean, I'm really glad that I did the A-level. Obviously, I did really well in it, so that it came quite easily to me, especially compared to physics. I'm not sure that it's hard to talk about that in a way, because I don't want to create a hierarchy of subjects. But let's just say I don't know whether with better teachers I would have done better in physics. I did the maths and did the chemistry, and that was okay. But yeah, I ended up with psychology kind of by accident, and actually even more bizarrely, I applied my degree. I had applied to do psychology and maths together. And when I got there was some admin error, and I was just on the straight single honours psychology. And I, for whatever reason, I just didn't query it. And so I ended up not doing the maths part of psychology. So it's a bit of a series of accidents, really.
So your life is a series of accidents that bring you to being a very prominent face of conversation analysis to the external world. I mean, so you must look back at it sometimes and wonder what happened. How did this?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do think that. Yeah, and I never saw any of it coming and didn't plan any of it at all. I liked my psychology degree, but not especially. It was okay. I sort of enjoyed it. I actually thought that my career would be in bookselling of some kind, because I had spent all my summers while I was at university working in a little tiny village in Wales called Hay-on-Wye, which has a very small population but 40 second-hand bookshops.
Oh, wow.
And I was working there, and I ended up getting married to a Dickens specialist and lived in Hay-on-Wye for a bit. So I thought I would do something along those lines because I was very bookish. But then after my degree, I just applied for everything that came out in the newspaper in the UK at the time. I don't know if it is the same now. It was the Guardian newspaper on Tuesdays was all the higher education stuff. So I was just applying for everything with psychology in it, and ended up on this PhD studentship. And to be honest, I didn't 100% know what a PhD was. I knew it was grand.
Right.
But the woman who became my supervisor, we just really got on. And very quickly, I became socialized and knew what I was doing, and I was very hardworking, so that helps.
I think most of us, I mean, if you look at those involved in ethnomethodology or conversation analysis, ended up here quite by accident. I don't know that. There's no grand plan to it. I mean, I was a psychology major in college when I first entered. I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
And I took one sociology class, really liked it, didn't know what ethnomethodology was until my PhD program. And then I was like, oh, there's this thing that kind of fits how I view the world and seems to be really useful at examining how people do what they do. And I was interested again, and what I studied was intercultural communication in Arab-owned liquor stores. So African-American customers, Arab liquor store workers, how they communicate with one another or don't. And the reason being, I was interested in how people can communicate more effectively and collaborate more effectively.
Yeah.
It was all like this, I want to make a difference. And to me, ethnomethodology and CA were the primary kind of disciplines that had application value.
Yeah.
There was always a direct line between we're studying this thing and we can do something with it, versus most academics didn't have that.
Yeah. I mean, I never made those connections though until much later on. I didn't really think of it like that, but yeah.
I was a bit of a radical. I mean, it was interesting that I was in a Marxist program as an undergraduate and master's student. It was all about change. It was all about, making change in the world. And then I started learning about ethnomethodology and conversation analysis and started studying people who were actually working on making change. And how I gravitated towards workplace studies was because of that element of people working in industry as applied sociologists, using the tools that we had. And also, I think for me, maybe it was the same for you, privileging the expertise of the people we were studying versus having the PhD person being the expert on the topic.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me as well. Yeah.
Well, that's relief, because if it didn't, it would have made it for a very awkward rest of the conversation. and what, and the people in the UK, I mean, with the luminaries like a Wes Sherrick or a Rod Watson or a Graham Button or et cetera, how do you see like this next generation of CA people fitting into that earlier kind of generation? Because it does seem to be, you all seem to be very good at publicizing yourselves. I'm very jealous at how out in the open everyone is about really being ambassadors for what the thing is.
That's an interesting question. It's interesting in terms of the people that you listed there. And so obviously I've been around long enough to have met quite a lot of the people in the UK who are in Ethno CA. And maybe it's because I'm a bit of an outsider to both communities, having come from a psychology discipline, not sociology and not linguistics. And coming specifically, coming 5 years into my career to work at Loughborough in particular and work with the Discourse and Rhetoric group. There's so much over the years, there's been so much sort of debate and politics around what is discursive psychology vis-a-vis conversation analysis and ethnomethodology and membership categorization analysis. And you can't help but bump up against people who have a view about who's in the club and who isn't, what counts as CA and what doesn't, what counts as ethno and doesn't. I have no idea really how my work is taken by any of those particular constituencies. I've tried to just do what I'm interested in, and occasionally you kind of get to know these things that you sort of find out that someone's not very impressed with your analysis, or they are, or they don't like that you have taken this work into this kind of community, or they do. In the end, you just can't worry about it. And I think one thing that doing all this conversation analysis in public has taught me is to just toughen up and do your best work, and then that's it. That's all you can do. I can sort of see trajectories of conversation analysis going in particular directions, and ethnomethodology, at least to me, it always felt like a much more closed shop, like it was a much more quite male dominated club. And that sometimes gets perpetuated even now. So at the IIEMCA conference last year, there were a couple of panels which were either all or mostly men, for instance, and I wonder to myself sometimes, where are the women in ethno? There are some key women in ethno, but nevertheless, there, a lot of them are in CA, and so that tells you something. People do talk about these things as different approaches entirely, whereas I see them as very close family members, if not in the same family, really. And I would include discursive psychology in that as well. So there's lots of politics. I generally try to stay out of it and do what I want to do, because you're never going to please everybody, and that's just humans for you. Humans 101. That's my psychologist.
Right. Well, it's good advice. Having kids, I know you can't please people.
Yeah.
Please them at all. And I when I first was around, when I came to Nottingham for, I think it was the International Institute of Ethnomethodology and Conversation Analysis, IIEMCA.
Yeah.
One of the things that I remarked about was that the ethnomethodologists and CA people just struck me as kind of like this motorcycle gang element, because they were originally in the discipline of sociology, outsiders. I mean, people couldn't get jobs, right? Literally couldn't get jobs if they had Garfinkel as an advisor, and that's a whole other story. Or if they were doing this thing that no one else recognized as being, either theoretically driven or overly positivistic, whatever it was. And so the idea that you feel like an outsider, not in the club, and I decided long ago I'm not in the club. There's nothing more EMCA than being an outsider in EMCA.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of like the pinnacle of EMCA-ness.
Yeah.
Because I do wonder, I know this is a larger conversation, and I also want to talk about some of all the work you've done. To what extent has the enterprise started to adopt the trappings of the thing that it was originally trying to escape? Especially in CA, where is it people saying, I have tapes, how do I apply the thing to the tape so I can do my analysis, versus really understanding the foundational reasons for why it kind of is doing what it's doing in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think with every generation that goes down the line, it's really important for researchers to know why they're doing their research and studying the world this way rather than some other way. I mean, when I came to Loughborough, there were lots of arguments in and around psychology and sort of discourse analysis and discursive psychology in psychology, different traditions, different approaches, lots of debates, lots of camps, and lots of arguments. And at the time, pretty much all PhD students had to write this elaborate justification for why they were doing the work in a discursive way rather than some other way. But then I think time has moved on, and things just become an accepted paradigm, an accepted method, a way to do things, and no one questions it anymore. But I suppose one of the problems with that is that you can then stop thinking about why it is that you're doing the work that you're doing, the answer shouldn't just be because my supervisor told me to do it this way or something like that. I can actually remember being very lucky and going to one of the UCLA CA boot camps in 2004 with Shegloff and Jean Lerner, and one of the things that they actually pushed quite hard was don't if you've got, like, they gave this analogy of a record, a vinyl record, and the grooves are already set, and you just put the stylus on and you just follow the thing that has already been set. And I guess working with them, and then also working with Jonathan Potter and Derek Edwards here, who were sort of pioneering things. You're never going to pioneer and innovate if you just follow what everyone else has already done with your material. You have to think about how you can innovate as well, and take things into different domains and augment them and shape them. And I think there's a lot of that going on as well. So that's good. I think overall, my sense is that CA and Ethno is very healthy.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not as involved in it as I once was, but from, like I said, I'm very impressed by how folks at Loughborough and just over in Europe and UK in general are really out in social media. Yes. Are giving TED Talks, are in The Guardian, are engaging. I don't see, maybe I'm just not aware of it, but I don't see that same level of public engagement on the United States side. And I don't know if I'm missing something that you could say, no, it's happening. So-and-so is doing such and such. I just don't see that public face of engagement and translation as much over here as I do over in the UK and Europe. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I mean, obviously my TED talk was in the US, and I've been to Google twice and Microsoft and worked quite a lot in the US. So, but that I can't speak for other people, but I know that I've certainly done a lot of the same kind of public science in the States as well as in the UK.
Well, I definitely think there's an appetite for it. I just don't know that
Yeah.
people who are, you know, you're able to accomplish this thing, which is kind of unique. And I like to think of myself as able to do it somewhat too, which is be an academic, but also be an applied person in a public space. By public, I mean both socially and also working with organizations outside of academia on projects that are not intended for academic outlets, although you also
Yes.
publish that material too. That's
Yes.
a hard rope to walk, is to
Yeah.
both be in the academic world and also do this other externally facing stuff. And I don't know if it's the British system, if that promotes it, because I know the US system does not, especially in sociology. There is this kind of stigma against doing both. If you're doing applied work, it's taken away from academic work, and it's devaluing you as an academic.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are always going to be people who think that way. Maybe inside and outside academia, maybe less outside, because by definition, they're going to be the ones who might find your academic work because you did some public science. Yeah, I mean, I suspect that there are plenty of people who don't like the idea of doing conversation analysis in public, but I do, so I'm going to keep doing it.
And you've done a lot of stuff. I mean, you're not, again, not a traditional academic in that you've studied like one thing your entire career. You've studied a lot of things your entire career.
Yeah.
And so how do you come about with a new kind of area of research and focus in the course of your studies?
Again, by accident, all of it really. I've just followed my nose, and one thing's led to another. I'm lucky in that sense as well, because when I started to do initially all this work was with mediators, because Derek and I had this project on community mediation, and we were able to find out sort of, we were working on identities and conflict and that kind of thing. And I became quite interested in how the mediators might benefit from seeing what they're doing that gets people to say yes to their services or not. So it sort of started there. And then because mediation, I think it's all by coincidence really. Mediation is quite often not a profession that someone only does mediation, so they'll often do other things as well. So I would be talking in a room full of volunteer mediators, and it turns out that there was like a senior police officer in there who was the route through to the crisis negotiation, or there was someone who worked for a big sales organization, and that was the route to that project. So just by talking to mediators in the first instance, with no plan at all except that you might find this useful, there were people in the room that I had no idea were going to then find this work compelling and want it to happen in their organization. So it's just a series of chances and coincidences. Somebody in end of 2013 decided they would fund something big. So obviously that was really great, because it made me able to appoint Ryan Sickverland, who's worked with me for 5 years. And obviously, because these organizations will often fund something, it means that I've been able to employ postdocs, and that has meant that we have the capacity to actually do all of the research in all of these different settings. I mean, there's no way I could do it on my own, just 100% not. So yeah, we've been able to proliferate work. And of course, the other thing is as well, that as you practice, you just get better at doing things. You get more efficient, you get more able to focus on what it is in this organization that's going to be the interesting thing. You also start to connect it to, you study this one thing in this one organization, it turns out to be a very similar practice that you've seen in some other organization. And so the whole thing starts to snowball. And you can't see this coming. I don't think you can plan it again, but that's what's happened.
Well, one time I was talking to an administrator, and he was making a comment about looking at some academics' vitas for promotion and tenure and whatnot. And he was critiquing a person for being a dilettante. And I didn't quite know what that meant, so I had to look it up. And I went, oh, that's me. It wasn't talking about me, but it's like this varied interest in across a number of different fields where that you're not necessarily committed to one topic. And
Yeah.
you know, God bless anybody who wants to spend their life doing one topic. I could never do it. I like to tell people I have research ADD, where I just find interesting things. And as opportunities come up, I just kind of grab them because I'm like, that's really interesting. I want to learn more about that thing.
Yeah.
Which runs counter to the academic model of you spend your career becoming an expert in an area where you become recognized in a very narrowly defined area. Whereas with your career, you're expert in a lot of different areas, and then you have the skill to integrate them together, which then makes you a person who can talk to almost anybody and give them recommendations on how to improve things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the conversation analyst's skill as well, because a lot of conversation analysis is, even if colleagues are studying one particular domain, mostly like medicine or medicine. A lot of people study healthcare communication in various ways, or law maybe, but we are first and foremost conversation analysts, and most people train on all sorts of materials. So we'll have, most people will have at some point studied one of the classic conversations, either from the Holt corpus in the UK or one of the, the American data sets. So I think, although you're right, I've studied lots of different types of settings. The thing that brings it all together is I'm studying social interaction. So that's my narrow bit is social interaction, and my broad bit is in many settings.
I was texting you from an event I was at recently on speech analytics. And one of the things that struck me was there's a job description now called interaction analyst.
Yeah.
and these are people who are using speech analytics data that are generated by these, software systems or, SaaS systems, software as a service system.
Yeah.
To generate some high level data around what's happening in interactions and, like, for instance, call centers, either inbound or outbound. And it's an interesting moment to be a conversation analyst, because before, at least when I was talking with people at this conference, I didn't have to justify what it is I did for a living. When I said I study conversations, they immediately got interested.
Yeah.
When I talk to lawyers about police interrogations, they immediately get interested.
Yeah.
Are you finding that in the arc of your career? Are you finding that more and more that people are like, oh, yeah, we need that?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So I spent actually 4 months last year working in an SaaS company, in Typeform in Barcelona, where they basically do online data collection, conversational style. So managed to sort of embed some conversation analytic principles in their software, in their templates and their kind of machine, their engines. Certainly, the police are very interested because language is their business. Medics also very interested because they appreciate the fact that they have to communicate very horrible things sometimes to people, and there probably are more or less ways of, better or worse ways of doing that. So yeah, I think it's much easier to engage organizations where communication is their business, and they also, like I said earlier on, some people are clearly tired of or suspicious of some of the sort of guru-led communication stuff. And it's very common. I mean, I attend a lot of events where I'm not always the only speaker, so I get to see a lot of other people talking about, let's just call them soft skills. And I do cringe sometimes and think, but that's just wrong. And, but compelling. And that's the problem with communication. There's a lot of stuff out there that is very compelling, but wrong.
And so do you tell them, that's wrong? That what you just said was not right or incorrect. I mean, how do you handle those situations of being the academic who wants to say, actually, that's not correct. That's, based on these invalid assumptions, or it's an interpretation or whatever, versus not necessarily wanting to be an academic who says those things? Because who likes
it depends on the context. It depends on the stakes. If I sort of feel like it's not really going to make any difference to the audience whether I intervene or not, then why would you? It's still a hard thing to do. But if I think it's consequential or just dodgy in some way, then I might say something. But the problem is, if you're on the lineup of speakers and you're going after somebody who is speaking on the stage right now, you don't want to undermine them So like it's quite difficult sometimes. And the other thing that very often happens is that you get recruited into somebody else's talk. So, you know, I'll do my talk and then somebody else will come on next and they'll recruit parts of what I said in their talk. And sometimes they get it completely wrong. So, you know, yeah, and sometimes they get it right and that's okay as well. But I think it's because the subject is so, it belongs to everybody, of course. Conversation is only for humans. So the problem is, though, that a lot of humans think they know it already because they do it already and they've been doing it all their life and they know exactly what works. And that's the problem with communication. It's not like trying to, you know, if I went on and explained the complexity of, I don't know, some crystalline structure in chemistry, then no one's going to come on and do a take on that. It's just what it, you know, that the science of it is not, it's not there and accessible. It's not designed to be accessible. Whereas if you're talking about conversation, then it's only designed to be accessible and people have a view, and that's why they've got this strange double-edged thing of it being really important but not quite important enough.
Yeah, one of the ways I've started talking about with people is saying, you know, do you know how to drive a car? And they'll say, yes, I know how to drive a car. Then I'll ask, do you know how the engine works? And they'll say no. I said, but you can still drive the car, right? I said, I understand how the engine works.
Yeah,
you know, that
that's a nice analogy. Yeah.
Well, thank you. You're free to use it in your next TED Talk, says I don't know that I'm going to make that level, but I think it's, you know, then they get, oh, I understand. And that's why you take your car to a mechanic. Yeah. Because even though you can drive it, you know generally how it works. You really don't understand the intricacies of it, and you can't necessarily design it to work better, and you can't fix it when it breaks down. And that's what conversation analysts can do is is improve it, turbocharge it if you need to, and also fix it when it breaks down and let you know why it broke down, and then hopefully charge you a lot of money for it by the hour.
I mean, I use similar sort of the idea of what's going on under the bonnet. I don't know what that translates to in American English, but we would say under the hood. So I would talk about under the hood as well. Right.
Yeah, bonnets are hats for us. In the 1950s in the musical Oklahoma.
Yeah, whereas a hood is like a hat is.
That's a hoodie.
Yeah. Oh no, but that's also a hood. Yeah.
Is it also a hood?
Yeah.
So, what's your translation now into people in business? I mean, so what are you working on right now in terms of helping people apply conversation analysis to either law enforcement, community organizations, business, SaaS services? I mean, how are you translating in what areas right now?
Still working with the police on crisis negotiations, having done a lot of training for Police Scotland and the Metropolitan Police. Doing some work with a company, another SaaS company actually, called Deployed. I'm not quite sure where that will end up, but they are a company that is sort of appreciating in a type form way how a conversation analyst's knowledge and mind can improve the user, the UX of their product. I get asked to do. So my work used to be very much, I would do workshops. So I would take findings from mediation research or sales research or medical research and do training workshops. And I still do some of those, but I also do quite a lot of just sort of public lectures or guest lectures at organizations that are quite varied. So I have done things as varied as Tatler magazine in Vogue House, which was a bit surreal. And the one most recently, which I think is probably quite cool, is T2 Interactive Games. So I think they're a video game company, and they were interested in just generally a conversation, of course, because their job partly is to create some kind of authenticity in dialogue in games. But I've been doing this research with colleagues. The paper came out just a month ago or so, with colleagues here at Loughborough, Saul, Albert, Magnus Harmon, Ryan Sickberland, and then at Cardiff, Will Housley. And we wrote a paper, and I'm amazed we got away with the title, really, but the title is Can Humans Simulate Being Other Humans? Because I'm still really interested in the fact that most training is in simulation, in role play. Most assessment of people's communication skills is in role play. And so the question has to be, does role play look anything like the thing that the real, does it look like the real encounter where the stakes are different? And so now I have a couple of pieces of research that basically say, no, they don't. And this particular paper, Can Humans Simulate Being Other Humans, is, if you really want to push this far, people could get quite angry about the fact that in the mystery shopper simulated client environment, whereby a simulated client might go into an organization unknowing. So there is, the service provider doesn't know they're talking to a simulated client, and the simulated client reports back on the performance of the provider, and their own initiating actions, if you like, are entirely not under scrutiny. So this paper is about what is it that the simulated clients are doing compared to a real client in requesting a service. And it turns out that the simulated client requests service in a completely different way to if you really want the service. And yet no one knows. Right. And, I can get quite worked up about this because this is people's jobs and careers and promotions or not. And on the basis of an apparently rigorous methodology of simulated clients. So that makes me angry, but also I think it has really interesting implications for research methods. So all of this stuff has got implications for and a kind of empirical test for those of us who might object to interview-based research, where we ask people to report on conversations or report on experience or tell us about their life. And a lot of, obviously CA Ethno generally object to that kind of way of gathering data because we want to study the actual life, not the account of life. But this I think this type of research where you compare what people do in a simulated encounter versus the real thing gives you a bit of bite to that argument, which is we can now show that people don't do the same thing when they are enacting it for some other purpose versus when they're really doing it. And of course, it also has implications for conversation design in SaaS and AI and speech analytics, because you just know that people are picking up and designing in the wrong things into their products of all kinds, because they have, if you think that the simulated client is enacting what they think somebody would do in this situation, then that's a decent estimate or approximation for what someone thinks is going to happen, and we build that into our conversational design, or we build it into our assessment, or we build it into our training. Yeah.
I think you hit on one of the most important things that I'm seeing is that people want to do something with this data. They just have no idea what to do with it. And so we can sit there and say the simulated shopper does not act like a real shopper in these ways, and that's fine. And they might know that. But then the question is, okay, so like, what do we do? And the traditional academic approach would just be to stop by pointing out it's not right, and then be annoying without giving a solution. And your ability to translate is that solution element. It's building that intervention, which I would call and is defined as clinical sociology. It's creating an intervention to improve the outcome of the situation based on your knowledge as a academic, but also with your real life understanding of how it works in an actual situation.
Yeah, and with data, so one thing that's quite nice actually about having the sort of simulated client encounter and the real client encounter is that then you can actually you can identify what is good practice from the actual practice, not by approximating the practice and getting it wrong. And at my most radical, I would say, we just shouldn't do simulation, because we have the means to study people actually doing their jobs, because everything's recorded now, whether for good reasons or bad. So we can do that. I mean, I studied, like yourself, legal settings, because they're recorded anyway, for the purposes of the law. So why would you run simulations when you can actually look at the real practice? And you need a conversation analyst to, as you say, show them how the engine works. And also tweak the training. So at least you can, as a very minimum, conversation analysis can change what people are being trained to do, and also what they're being assessed on.
Right. And I think part of the, for at least me at least, part of the radical program of EMCA has been about, who's expert. It's the practitioners who are expert.
Yeah.
Especially in the call centers, letting management know that the people you have on the phones actually know stuff about how these things work, because they're engaged in them in real time all the time. And we can capture their expertise and then look at it in the data to really provide guidance based on their own endogenous practices on how to make that tacit more explicit, more actionable.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it's really important to frame what you do in those ways as well. So, you know, when we go and train an organization and its members for the first time, we want to be really clear that we're not coming to tell you what to do. We're going to show you what you do. Your expertise, your tacit knowledge, the things that you've tried, the things that you have abandoned, the things that you have landed on that is effective, and we'll see that it is. And it's quite important for us to also articulate that to people that we're talking to, so that they don't, because we want them to trust us. We don't want them to think that we're just academics coming in with, you know, airy fairy ideas because we think we know better. That's not our job, and that's why it's really, you know, conversation analysis is perfect for this kind of work, because there is not a huge conceptual gap between what we do and what people do. We are, you know, they're the same in a way. And although, of course, like any science, we have our language for describing things, you don't need those when you are talking to people doing their job. Some of the language helps a bit sometimes, but yeah, it's not like you're trying to, again, turn some really complex cultural theory into something that people can, like, turn into something practical in everyday life. You're basically turning something that is already practical in everyday life into something, you know, more finessed or just more targeted with regards to what works and what doesn't work.
Is there any idea where your nose is going to lead you next, since you're following your nose through your entire career and just kind of accidentally bumping into things? Like what's the next thing to bump into?
Well, the next thing is underway. So the work with Deployed is kind of underway. And I also have a new project. I'm working with colleagues at University of Leeds and Leeds National Health Service Trust midwife, research midwife. And we're looking at recordings of midwives talking to pregnant women about screening. So the interest is in, why do women say yes or no to screening?
Right.
So
that seems important.
Yeah. Again, what I feel really lucky to be able to do is that these are people keep finding me and coming with a potential project. And I also know from experience that a lot of people have a lot of ideas about projects. And so for every 10 approaches, one of them might lead somewhere. And that's completely fine. That's just the way it is. So I know from experience that lots of people will have that initial enthusiasm and interest, and then it fades away, or something else takes over, they're busy or whatever it is. And then, but there's enough push in some of them where we're going to end up with an interesting project. So that project is happening now, and the training is already scheduled for May. So this is the other thing about working in this way. The data collection is nearly finished, and we deliver it in May. So it's fast, this work. So you have to be quite confident that you can identify the trainable things in these materials. Publication will happen later, but this is how we work in CALM. We work quite rapidly because and efficiently, with not that much funding, but enough to do the work. So.
And of course, the scary thing is, if those 10 things that are possibly happening, if a lot of them actually end up happening, then it's panic time. Yeah,
I can't do it all.
No. Well, no. And it sounds like you have a great group there to work with as well, which makes it more fun.
Yeah. I mean, sadly, Ryan is leaving at the end of this term. He's going back to Norway, and he's going to be an associate professor in Trondheim. But we'll see. You know, I just keep following my nose.
Well, sounds like it's done well for you so far. So I think any advice to the contrary would be counterproductive. I mean, why? If like we say in the U.S., if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't know if you say that in the U.K.
We say the same thing. So yeah.
You say ain't?
If it isn't broke, we would say isn't.
Yeah, we say if it ain't.
Yeah.
You gotta say ain't.
Yeah. We might say it in that way, in that American way. You know, trying to put on the American accent. We might do that as well.
Sure, and we might put on a British accent. Now, if I say the bonnet, if I say lift under the bonnet, I will put on, or airy fairy. Airy fairy is the other term.
Yeah, airy fairy is good.
That I learned today. So that if I learned nothing else today, I learned bonnet, and I learned airy fairy, and I learned you should just follow your nose. And if the BBC calls to put you on a program, you should always say yes. Yeah,
I'm actually talking to the BBC again on Friday for a program called Word of Mouth. So That I don't know if you know that program. It's Michael Rosen. So
No.
maybe I'll be doing something on word of mouth.
Well, it sounds like there's going to be a lot more phone calls happening.
Yeah.
Or emails. So,
Yeah.
so thanks a lot, Liz. And by the way, how do you say your last name?
Stokoe rhymes with cocoa.
Stokoe. So I'm not the first person that asked that question, apparently.
No, a lot of people ask me that question. It's a strange name.
See, I knew that as a conversation analyst, you had a canned response and there was no gap and no overlap between
Yeah.
how you said your last name and having the illustration of how to say it.
Yeah, I use that one a lot. Rhymes with cocoa. Yeah.
So that was my CA abilities in full effect right there.
Yeah. Yeah.